I now invite the Prime Minister to state his case.
Can I be heard?
Yes.
Bolsonaro actively endorsed military torture and wants to destroy the Amazon. Yet he has been the president of Brazil for 2 years because he promises economic growth. On the other hand, you have Obama's Obamacare, which actually helps the lower classes receiving backlash from the Caucasian lower classes because of his race. We think these are the instances where outside factors have harmed progression and harmed populations. So proud to go. The problem that we see in this debate today is that background information, things like rhetoric, things like your party, things like your money, and things like your race, all affect who you vote for, and we think that is fundamentally unfair because the actual policies are then left in the dust, and then we think that's the only thing that it actually matters. Our stance is that people need to vote only on the basis of these policies, right? Because that is the only thing that one incentivizes progress, and two is fundamentally fair. That being said, we have two burdens to the House today. Firstly, how we limit prejudice, and secondly, how we better policies. Our model for this debate today is that we're not going to change the system. We will not be limiting those who can run for office. We will not be abolishing the party system. All we are doing is we are changing the presentation of these policies, because now we are going to have a system where through things like flyers, through things like newspapers, through things like discussion panels, you learn and understand anonymously what the policy of the candidates are and the mechanism for this policy. And we will have this information fact-checked by this candidate A who backs the welfare system, and we'll do this through X, Y, and Z. That's what essentially this is going to look like. We have three main arguments for the House today. I'm going to be handling the first two, and then Senate is going to talk to you about our third. First argument then on how status quo spreads biases and exacerbates harms. The thesis of this argument, discriminating in society essentially blinds them to the benefits of these policies. How? First on what are these policies, right? We think that fundamentally, regardless of the side, the basis behind the majority allows prejudice in this system, right? Because once prejudice now prevents them from supporting what they actually want. For example, we told you about Obamacare, right? We think that is harmful because it one undermines democracy, right? Because it allows policies to be passed based almost entirely on rhetoric, right? Because that is what appeals to people. That's how you have situations like Trump coming up and saying he'll help farmers, so they'll be on his side, regardless of the fact that it's really a claim and he doesn't really tell you how he does that, right? We think that that is harmful because this rhetoric becomes more important than the mechanism, right? It sets a precedent that you just have to say the right thing and not back it up. Why is that? We think that one, it allows for dangerous ideas to be spread in society, right? Because you now have things like Republicans scapegoating minorities so they get votes. You now have things like Mahinda Rajapaksa criticizing the 2015 government without actually giving a solution. So third prong on what happens on our side of the House. bias, right? We think that we fundamentally remove these biases in society, right? These things like sex, things like orientation, and things like race now
Point of
do not
information.
matter. This allows for more representation from these minority groups, right? Because you are more likely to have things like black presidents on our side of the house, or the first ever Tamil president on our side of the house, right? As you now know, have they, as long as they support the views of the majority, right, which we think is what's fundamental to democracy anyway. We think that that breaks down stereotypes, right, because we see that now the majority sees that it does not, your race or your sex does not affect your competency. You're more likely to have a new appreciation for this group as a whole. That looks like a white middle class family of second term, even though they did not vote for him in his first term, because they
Point of
realized that he
information.
was efficient. Before my second argument, yes, sir, your point.
Assuming misguided votes are a significant issue, would you force all voters to pass a test before getting the right to vote?
So we think in society there's anyway a level of competency and responsibility you have to have. That's why things like underage children cannot vote. So we think we already have a relatively fair system in that. Second argument then on how we create more effective governments, right? The thesis to this is that we allow for democracy to take hold and thereby lead to a more progressive society. So first on what does blind voting do? When you remove all these outside factors besides policy, you essentially guarantee that these candidates will only win on their policies, right? This means that one, you increase the competition for better policies, right? Because every candidate has an incentive to make their policies the most appealing one, right? Without rhetoric and without the with the requirement to explain themselves, as we said in our model. This means that we are going to get better policy, because now whatever they back, they have to make sure it makes sense and purely based on facts.
Information.
You're more likely then to have extremist compromise on things that to make things more appealing, right? For example, Trump can't just come up and say that Mexicans take jobs. He has to say why that's statistically true, and we don't think he can effectively do that. So he's far more likely to say something like we need a more sensible immigration policy, and actually it pushes him to get that XYZ mechanism on how that works. Second prong then on how you better politicians. Now that it's all about the policies, we think that you're far more likely to get candidates who have
Point of information.
policies but don't have the rhetoric in status quo, or have some underlying factor that doesn't allow them to win in status quo, like such as them being homosexual. So people don't essentially listen to them. For example, we think that Mayor Pete in the States, right, is an extremely supported liberal politician, but could not get into government because of the fact that he is gay, right? This means that candidates that take part are inherently going to be better politicians, right? Because you're more likely that you're going to have people like educated scholars who come up with more favorable policies for everyone, and less likely that you have people like Boris Johnson who essentially just scapegoats Muslims and thereby gains votes. We think the impacts of this is firstly that you gain a better government, right? Because it is better policies and it is better politicians. We think that by that means you are it's more likely that you have a government that does not antagonize half the population like we see in America at the moment, right? And by that means you create far more unity, right? We think they don't have that on their side, because on their side of the house you have this polarization and you have this backlash against the system, which leads to things like the Black Lives Matter movement. So we see that on their side of the house, it's one that prioritizes outside factors that essentially compromise on democracy. On our side of the house, we see that we, one, fundamentally solve the injustices of the electoral system, right? And two, we change mindsets to the point where we benefit the most vulnerable stakeholder in this debate, which is the people. Side with proposition, who has now fundamentally told you why it's principally valid to have this, and practically how you're going to get more progression in society. Side with Trump.
I thank the speaker for his speech, and whenever the adjudication panel is ready, the leader can start his case.
Good to go. Good to go.
I now call upon the opposition leader to state his case.
I don't think about many days about rhetoric campaigns aren't important. They are. If you're a politician that isn't able to get the support of your people, you aren't going to get support of parliament. You aren't going to be able to like leaders and get concessions that you're going to. He said rhetoric cannot be important. Inside propositions world, politicians like Donald Trump can come and say they're going to bring good immigration policies and then go out and build a wall. Those kind of people are going to increase to a drastic extent, and that is why we strongly are against this system of blind voting. 3 rebuttals before moving on to my positive matter. Firstly, when they come and say, look, the parties are not important. Understand as to why parties are important is first, there's a sense of accountability in parties. That is to say, if an individual goes out of line, you know there's going to be a great backlash and scrutiny against that party, but also understanding majority of cases, parties that have a great deal of history are not going to go out and do bad policies or bring forward bad policies. Second, understand how this came up and said, look, politics and politicians should not be linked, and look, things like rhetoric aren't important. First, understand the policies are measured by what kind of politicians that bring forward these policies. Look, if a politician is untrustworthy, you understand, irrespective of whether or not your policy might be good, these politicians aren't good. But second, understand why rhetoric is so important is the fact is, irrespective of whether or not you get into parliament, to persuade the people in the parliament to pass your policies, rhetoric is so important. Third point of rebuttal is to understand that, look, politics past are just appealing in status quo. That is truly wrong. But understand that there's a great deal of opposition in society right now. Look, if our policies are just appealing and they don't have any matter, the fact of the matter is the oppositions are going to go out and break down that policy and show why this policy is wrong, because of the fact that will help the opposition come into power. So we don't believe them characterizing policies in society right now as just being appealing without any matter is sensible. Moving on to my positive matter, firstly, one point of framing to understand what this debate is basically about. There's an incredible amount of paternalistic conception of the state. That is to say, individuals in society right now are increasingly fed up with the state. The state tells you that your interests are being provided, but the fact of the matter is the state makes that choice. There's a great deal of apathy by voters right now in status quo, and that is why we see so many voters not turning up. There's historic amount of voters not turning up, for example, in the United States, in example, in Singapore and Poland. The fact of the matter is, what happens inside proposition's house is apathy for the state increases to a great deal and cannot be controlled. What is the counterfactual that we support? First, we support politicians and the state increasing information about the politicians and the policies. Second, we allow state subsidiaries to have programs that tell individuals what kind of policies these politicians will bring forward. Secondly, we have websites to show and information about the candidates and their policies. And fourthly, we give them information, for example, about things like taxation. Let me be clear, ladies and gentlemen, where we draw the line is where the state choose which kind of people get into positions of power. That is where we draw the line. 2 burdens for this house. First is to understand why blind policy is an assault on democracy, and secondly, how it worsens the governments in the long term. 2 arguments then. First is as to why blind voting undermines democracy, and secondly, why it creates bad politics. Before moving on, just their point.
Sir, do you believe that people buy into the rhetoric more than policies? Sir, do you believe that people buy into rhetoric more than policies?
Fact of the matter is, as I told you, policies in status quo aren't these kind of appealing things. There are actual matter in these policies. Moving on to my argument, firstly, on the framing of this argument. States are incredibly powerful and controlling structures that dictate the way you live. That is to say, you feel threatened by the prospect of the state, where you change your life and your life is manipulated by the state, and the people you love are being manipulated by the state. That is why at its core, the state needs to be controlled, and what happens inside proposition is the state has not been controlled. Understand what happens is the value of your vote, the sanity of your vote, which is so important, is lost. the state that you put your faith in is lost. And what happens then is the state's legitimacy is lost. 2 points in my 2 points in this argument is first to understand why knowing the person you vote for is so critical. That is to say, you need to make an enable character judgment in this scenario. 4 reasons as to why character judgment is so important. First, you have to understand how this person interacts with society as a whole. You can understand how this person interacts. You know how likely, irrespective of whether or not his policies might be good, how likely that policy is being passed will happen. That is to say, if a person is unrealistic and untrustworthy, you're not going to vote for it. Second, understand that, look, the fact of the matter is, what kind of policies are most important to to these politicians can be drawn. That is to say, look, AOC, understanding the Green New Deal, which is the most important to her, is that, look, if she came into power, irrespective of whether or not other policies would come into power, she would bring the Green New Deal into power. Understand, political capital is limited and there's a limited amount of time in power. You need to understand what kind of policies are most important and what kind of policies that president and parliament is going to pass. Thirdly, understand you can rely on past experiences. That is, say, irrespective of whether or not a policy is good, understanding that, look, a president who came into power and had good policies but didn't live up to the expectation might be able to come into power. That is to say, because you know that the policies are good, but it's a perspective and the perception of that president that changes. This internally harms the state because of the fact that you know that these politicians might have good policy and these policies are very approximate to each other. So you know, in majority of cases, these politicians will get into power because you can't distinguish between which politician this is and which individual this is. Fourth and most importantly, understand that there's not one interest when it comes to politics. That is to say, there's so many interests when you choose a parliamentary or a president. For example, if you take Sri Lanka, majority of individuals might have voted Sajid because they didn't want the Gotabaya Rajapaksa's parliament to gain a two-thirds. That is to say, because they knew that might be detrimental for the country, they did go out and take other reasons for this action. For example, you can see people not voting for Trump because you know Trump is a bad person who goes out and does sexual harassment of individuals. Those are the kind of problems that occur when you don't know the individual. Moving on to my second argument as to why it worsens policy. The framing of the argument is to say how there's a trend of apathy and voters not turning up. Firstly, understand why voters are going to be far more apathetic, because they know that they can't control policies and they can't control the outcome. That is to say, they don't know whether or not the state will put their hand into into choosing who this individual who came into power. That is to say, the state might be like, and who is most affected by this policy is the minorities. They are going to be far more apathetic because they might think, look, the state went out and were lying to them and took actions to put people they wanted into power. Secondly, understand how the government becomes illegitimate. That is to say, they don't know whether or not the government manipulated the people they wanted to come into power. Understanding these reasons, please side beside opposition. Yeah.
I thank the speaker for his speech, and whenever the judges are ready, I invite the deputy leader of side proposition to state his case.
Yep, good to go. Thank you.
I now call upon the Deputy Prime Minister to state his case.
Can we go?
Yes.
Panel, even though a country only has a very limited amount of racists, the reason as to why more than 50% of the United States population voted in Donald Trump, someone who deliberately harms minorities and scapegoats them and blames them for the failures of the country, is simply because of the power of rhetoric. It is where even the most rational people are able to buy into that rhetoric. That means, and that's the reason why you're able to vote in incompetent people like Trump, like Bolsonaro, etc. Panel, we told you, give you several harms as to why rhetoric is bad. The massive problem that we saw in this debate is that none of those harms were acknowledged, none of those harms were rebutted against. But regardless, let's take them at their absolute best. Two themes. First, as to whether who's principally justified in this debate. Secondly, as to who creates better politics. And then thirdly, my third substantive, I'll talk about why we better media representation of these people. Firstly, then, as the principle, they gave us two things. Firstly, they tell us that, look, the people should deserve to know what kind of people they are. They need to judge them, and therefore, and by doing this, they're able they're able to calculate the likelihood of this policy being drafted. Three responses. Firstly, panel will tell you that just because of seeing someone's face or seeing someone's race or color doesn't necessarily mean that you can determine their ability to draft policies. But we tell you that in status quo, this is not how it happens. In status quo, people disregard the policies and vote on the basis of race and identity politics and the kind of rhetoric that they use. So even on their side of the house, even if AOC is going to be able to draft a really good policy, they're still going to be crowded out by Fox News and by conservatives, and therefore people like them are going to be seen delegitimized. But secondly, we give you a mechanism. Secondly, they tell us that, look, the mechanism to put checks and balances on these people and therefore prevent this same politician from running a game with the same messed up policies aren't going to happen. Panel will tell you the next time this person gets into office, you're basically going to you're able to get this person out through things like other mechanisms like backlash and stuff. But thirdly, we tell you that even in the best case scenario where we are able to buy into this, we tell you on their side of the house as well, you're not necessarily going to be able to stop people like Marine Le Pen or Trump from running in a second term. Why is this the case? Because panel, note what are the kind of people there. They use rhetoric to mask their failures. We see even in the Rajapaksa family, even though the Rajapaksa was criticized so much for his policies, you still see Gotabaya being able to be on their side of the house, regardless of people knowing what these people and what their failures are. These people are still likely to be voted in. We would also give the example of the person in Sri Lankan Parliament who was voted in, even though he was a murder criminal. Even though people were aware of this, they still voted this person in simply because of the kind of rhetoric that the person has. So that one falls. But then secondly, they tell us that, look, you're unable to criticize these people on our streams. And we tell you the next time. So what they're basically telling is this. So the mechanism that you gave during your elections are going to be criticized, and therefore you won't be able to get these people. Panel, if the mechanism of your policy fails, then the next time when you compete for an election, people are going to look and see if the mechanism rectify the errors that it made in the past party. For example, if Bernie Sanders would be voted in because of his policies for Medicare for all, and if people saw problems with him during his presidency, people will look for the kind of rectification that should have, that corrected his mistakes. The next time his policy is being passed. This is how we vet out policies on the basis of mechanisms. But what did we tell you?
Information.
That's how this undermines democracy. Panel. It's not just rhetoric, but it's also the race you will come up with, the identity politics you're involved in. These are the majority of the deciding factors that happen on their side of the house. Because on their side of the house, they try to paint this image saying that the voting based on policies happens, but in actual reality, it doesn't. Because if it does, then I challenge them to, we question them, how exactly did people voting people like Trump or Bolsonaro or Marine Le Pen? On their side of the house, people are going to vote on the basis of identity politics. And they still haven't rebutted to any of our analysis that we gave you. But then second theme of rebuttal then, but before that I'll take a point. Seeing none.
Sorry. Do you think that rhetoric is completely unimportant and has no place at all in the political system?
Second, I'm guessing that you're trying to tie this to your argument about how it creates political apathy. I'll deal with this right now. Second theme of rebuttal then as to which side creates better politics. They first tell us that look, rhetoric is paramount in order to persuade people and therefore solve the problem of political apathy. This is the biggest problem that they brought you in this debate. So if we tackle this, we take their case. Three responses then. Firstly, panel, we tell you that policies can actually persuade people because these policies aren't just random text on a paper. This policy determines if for a farmer, if you're going to get subsidies for your farm. These policies determine if you're going to be able to send your son for an affordable school. This policy determines for a woman if she's able to get an abortion without backlash. These policies determine your entire life. For them to say that policies cannot persuade people is simply a premise that we reject. But secondly, we would argue that the kind of focus for these policies can be brought through things like mainstream media, for example. Sean already gave you the mechanisms that happen on our side of the house. Considering that now mainstream media cannot debate on things like the scandals of politicians or where these politicians come from. Their main incentive now is to basically debate about what kind of policies they make. This is how you get attention to people, and this is how you persuade them. But even in the best case scenario, we would argue, we still give you mechanisms such as the fact that you're going to talk about this through radios, you're going to disseminate this information through flyers and stuff. So we certainly don't think that political apathy happens. But even if we were to weigh this up, on their side of the house, they might get a few more extra voters. But what they're also getting is this: voters who are going to be persuaded by harmful rhetoric by populist leaders. The extra voters that they get on their side of the house are nuanced voters. These are people who are cheated by populist leaders. These are people who inherently buy into the vitriolic rhetoric that politicians bring on their side of the house. If the takeoff in this debate is a few voters being given out, we are perfectly fine with it, right? Third argument then as to how we better mainstream media. Panel, in status quo, we see news outlets that are inherently biased towards what kind of party you come from or what kind of person you are. It looks like Fox News that targets on menial things like scandals and all, and therefore delegitimize people like AOC or delegitimize people like Hillary Clinton. Why is this bad? Two reasons. Firstly, because it crowds out people with good policies. So even if you see AOC, who draws very good policies, consider millions of people watch AOC or Hillary Clinton being criticized by Fox News, they inherently believe that this person is illegitimate. But secondly, now these mainstream media like Fox News are able to make people inclined towards their own politicians, like Tom Cotton or Lindsey Graham. The impact is that you're able to sway voters. Secondly, you're able to criticize the usage of policies, which inherently changes what politics looks like. Instead of about competing about policies, it's going to be based about which person has more scandals than the other. And thirdly, it inherently hurts the image of politicians. But the only side that makes sure that none of this happens, but we better mainstream media, because now instead of talking about scandals and calling them out, they're going to talk to them about the actual policy. And they're the only side who makes sure that you don't get another Donald Trump, you don't get another Duterte into office where the motion stand.
I thank the speaker for his speech, and whenever the adjudicators are ready, call upon the deputy opposition leader to state his case.
Sorry, I'm getting stuck. Audible?
Yeah.
Thank you. Give me a sec, sorry. Anna, proposition wants to talk about individuals feeling fear. Proposition wants to talk about individuals being misinformed. I say those are the millions of individuals that get left behind when they don't get policy that acts in their interest. Or you feel like you don't know what the system is doing, or you feel like you have a lack of control. And that's the crux that they miss into this argumentation. That it's precisely when you feel powerless, when you feel like the machinations of the state are so paternalistic and so controlling in its extent, that you as an individual are unable to have your voice heard, that you feel left out, that you want to opt out of that system. That is what we supported in this debate. A few points of recharacterization before my argument, before I rebuild our arguments. The first thing is their big argument. Because I think it's kind of strange that proposition chooses to make the snug premise that Trump getting into power was a bad thing. Because if you look at it, Anna, the people who voted for Trump didn't necessarily do so because of Trump's rhetoric. Because if you look at Trump's rhetoric, it isn't very compelling. It isn't a particular kind of sentiment that he brings out in people, but rather the fact that you have millions and millions of individuals in America that are disillusioned with the fact that they're never getting policy, the idea that identity politics has like stripped away everything in their life of value, and who vote for Trump because they genuinely believe that migrants need to get out. If that is the case, Panna, the point is the same people are still going to get into power. But what changes in our world? I'm going to then integrate our argument on democracy. They tell you that rhetoric is unimportant, but I think they make a fatal flaw in this argument. Because if you look at the amount of extent of value they place on rhetoric, you'll believe that rhetoric is meaningless, that you're simply unable to judge a person's character, and that is the end of that debate. Sujit gave you 5 reasons why individuals' rhetoric is important. What were they? The first was it shows you how they interact with other individuals. Prop 2 flippantly responds to this and say, you can't judge how people interact with others, and what do you know about them other than their race or gender? I would argue that you can tell a significant amount about an individual, about how they act on social media. If you look at Trump, for instance, the fact that he was a sexual abuser or is accused of that, in that instance, is a factor that would go against him for someone who has been sexually abused in their life. The fact that your vote would principally be put onto that person, irrespective of you having made that choice, is something that we think is a moral harm. But also, you understand how that person interacts with other individuals in their coalition. So you know how likely they are to be able to garner support. You know how popular they are with other individuals. And the point is that it's regrettable that that is a factor, but you need to know how a person is going to function when they're in office. That is to say that if an individual isn't charismatic, if you aren't capable of rallying the vote, that means it's incredibly and significantly harder to rally support of the parliament, because the parliament is a diverse group of individuals with multiple interests who insist on working opportunistically to further their own gains. That is significant in a sense where to rally these individuals to a common cause, you need to be an individual with a certain amount of charisma. That's why individuals without that tend to get weeded out, irrespective of how good policy you are. You simply cannot be a president or a high-ranking figure if you don't have that control. And I'm going to extend this even further. If you become the figurehead of a state, for instance, in interacting with other countries and pursuing their own interest, again, it matters how charismatic you are as an individual, because that dictates the kind of policy you get. What is the quibble with this argument? It's that your policy is unimportant. I think that's a generally unnuanced vision of the marriage between policy and rhetoric, because often the characteristics of politicians that get into power tend to be a marriage between the two. So if people have not enough information status, we say our countermeasure works just as well. You give people the information. You give state subsidies like information as to what the kind of policies these people have, but you don't go to the full extent of making the decision for them. The second thing he told you was that you're able to rely on past experiences. Again, no response to this. The point is that if a person has been in power for a term and they haven't really done much, the point is you can vote them out. What's the difference in there? The point is because you're able to manipulate your policy, or even if your policy remains the same, given that they're still approximate to what you voted in last time, the same kind of candidates or the same kind of individuals from a political party are likely to get back into power. Because the fact is, if you're going to buy the argumentation, you as an individual need to marginally shift your political leanings like left or right or up or down in order to get someone out of power. I think that is unfair in terms of a democratic principle. The third, we told you that you're able to rely on other things that the person has done outside politics. If a person has a credible history of like managing finance, for instance, you're likely to understand that by extension, by inference, he's likely to be a good president. But the fourth thing he told you was that there were other interests that people might not want, like a majority government. Or you might be a minority individual who sees a minority candidate who doesn't have the same economic leanings as you, but you know that he's a first step into getting more minority candidates into power, so you choose to vote for him. All of these 4 reasons are harmed in their work. The extent of the analysis is then that you are somehow obliged as an individual to make a good one. We don't think that's true. Why? The framing that Sujit gave you at the top of his argument, that the state is an incredibly powerful and oppressive institution which is held in check by the fact that people have a vote. In an instance where the vote you make does not control who gets into power, or you're not able to make a reasonable approximation of who you want to get into power, that is the instance where you cannot take back, where you now have a justification to take back that control you give the state over your life. That's why being paternalistic as a state is so harmful, because now the state is able to make arbitrary value judgments over time as to what like a good standard of living for people is, as to what a good decision is. And notice they dodge the POI as to whether you give individuals, like make them write a test before getting the election, because the point is that would align with the same principles, that certain people, if they aren't voting in the way that proposition decides is the best way for them to vote, that is a harm in and of itself. We reject that premise. We say that irrespective of who you are, given that you have access to the right amount of information, we say that you are, as an individual, have the rationale to make the decision. And they make the trade-off again in the POI, where they say, oh, look, people who aren't children are rational. We think it's demeaning of them to say that people who vote for Trump are completely off their nut. They often have reasons, and we think that that should stand. The second argument then that I'm going to rebuild, and I'm going to include my own extension into this argument, is as to whether you get worse politics or not. The only thing we hear from them is that you somehow get better policy. I just want you to note, Panna, that drafting good policy does not necessarily mean you're likely to pass that policy. It does not mean that policy is likely to be implemented. But third, there are no safeguards to ensure that you do the policies that you claim that you set out you're going to do. So again, the only mechanism that they have going for them is the fact that you get voted out after 5 years. But even that doesn't necessarily stand in a context in which you're able to like just change a thing marginally and people don't necessarily know who you are. What do they get then in their world? The first is people feel like they no longer control the outcome. That is, you cannot vote out individuals. You don't know that the system is dying to you. The implication of this is that you lose out on the democratic legitimacy of the state. Two implications. The first of this is that what you get is the government being seen as illegitimate. That means in instances where you feel like your coalition... I'm sorry? It's at 7 minutes. I'm not sure what's happening.
Yeah, so they're just saying you're at 7 minutes. You're okay. Just take a second, get yourself ready to go, and then, yeah.
Would I be able to like roll back like 10 seconds?
Yeah,
because
roll back 10 seconds, that's absolutely fine. So this is start where you were sort of kicking off on this point.
Thank you. The implication of a government being seen as illegitimate is that your coalition is now able to say that you don't support the government's decision. So if you say a government comes into power and they have a leader that you might not necessarily support, the implication of this is the moment they pass a policy, that's when a group of people, say for instance some individuals in Texas, are able to say this is not necessarily the government we voted in, these aren't the policies, and we don't know how the system works, we refuse to acknowledge this. The fact is that is a fundamentally problematic premise for a democracy. The idea that individuals can simply choose to opt out of policy and the state has very little leeway or very little credibility to stand against that. Why? Because you don't have the democratic legitimacy that people know that the vote was free and fair. Finally, and very quickly, I'm going to respond to the third argument where they say that, but look, you take away mainstream politics like bashing people on news. Notice that the same kind of problems are still going to apply to like politics, where you're going to have Fox News like trivializing the policies of the liberal left. But the point is, even when you trivialize individuals, ability to fight back and say that this is not and like justify it. But secondly, and more importantly, it allows you to see their character. That is, you get a robust picture of individuals that are built up from multiple sources. And the point is, all we need to do as government is ensure that those are accessible. So for all these reasons, panel oppose.
I thank the speaker for his speech, and whenever the adjudication panel is ready, call upon the prop whip to state.
Am I good to go?
Yep, good to go.
This panel, we tell you that, look, even if all their sides are important, we tell you that what happens that impacts the people the most are the policies that impact these people. Because when it comes to policies, it's about whether farmers will get their subsidies, or whether the women will be able to draft things such as anti-discrimination laws, or whether the LGBTQ person will be able to walk on the street without being assaulted by gang members. These are all things that government policies are implemented. On their side, Janul can come up and talk to you about, oh, that look, charisma is so important. But if we don't have concrete policies that impact people, they lose this debate from the get-go. With that being said, two main clashes for the House. Firstly, on who actually benefits the people, and secondly, on this whole idea of who betters the politics of this country in the first place. On this first clash, they made two claims. The first claim they told was this whole idea that people need to be able to make character judgments. few responses. Firstly, that when it comes to people voting, people usually, especially people usually have those racial biases, racial or sexual orientation biases that they have. They can't say that because usually a lot of people usually have these kinds of biases. It is harder for people like minority groups and people like Barack Obama to come up in politics, especially countries which are extremely conservative like India or Pakistan. It's very hard for individuals who like
Point of information.
to actually come. So on their side of the house, you have very little change and very little minorities find it extremely hard to actually come up in these kinds of countries. But secondly, we tell you that policies that are actually good for people, that actually benefit people, are also taken away from their side. We gave the example of things such as Obamacare, where the policies are actually concrete and help people, but essentially get drowned out because of the racial preferences of people playing partisan politics. So on their side of the house, good policies also get those kinds of criticisms, and they also fall within those ideas. Right? But
point of information.
When it comes to rhetoric, people actually buy into rhetoric much more. People buy into Trump more because of the things he says, not because of the policies that he has, not because of what he has done, but more on the idea that he says things that is entertaining, that builds up, that fires up his base. Policies that this is extremely harmful because when you don't have those policies, right, that means that people are going to be left above. This looks like Mahindra blaming governments, but not essentially having those kinds of policies that actually benefit those kinds of people. Which is essentially saying that look, this side is wrong, but look, we don't have anything to say, and essentially people vote for those kinds of people because people are extremely susceptible to those kinds of rhetorics. So which people's lives are not going to be benefited on their side of the house. But even if they say that look, people vote for someone that goes against their norms and things like that, we believe that people will vote on the policy that will benefit them. This is like farmers saying that okay, look, I'm going to get things such as subsidies, I'm going to get bigger market access if this government comes into place. So which means that outside the house, those people, even if they vote against those norms, they still vote against the norms, they still benefited, right? On this parties and how you need to be able to appeal to parliamentary
information.
On our side panel, when you break up the norm of rhetoric, when you break up the norm of partisan politics, people who go into parliament are more likely to be people who actually care more about policy legislation and actually drafting those policies, which means you don't essentially need that kind of charismatic appeal that Janu likes to talk about. On our side of the house, we make sure that those policies are more important and the concrete substantives. But on our side of the house, we give you three things that don't exclusively happen in us. Firstly, so that polarization doesn't happen. This is to say that media organizations can't display partisan politics anymore and have to be able to take for policies for what they are. So it's like calling out Trump's immigration policies, calling out the Democratic
information
taxing policies. But secondly, that when it comes to rhetoric uses populism. Like Narendra Modi using his rhetoric to rise up in a populistic sense, or it's like Jair Bolsonaro using that kind of rhetoric to actually come up in politics and take Brazil's democracy with him, right? But thirdly,
point information.
On their side of the house, there's so many harms when it comes to people not voting on policies, and you drown in this partisan place happening. But on our side of the house, all those things are neglected. So you weigh this up, you have all those kinds of negative effects on their side, but none of them on our side. But the second
point of information
was this whole idea about criminals. This is the panel, we give a few responses. Firstly, when it comes to judicial aspects, usually when it comes to people who have committed crimes and things like that, they're usually barred by constitutions and things like that from running in the first place. But secondly, there are courts and things like that usually investigate these people when it comes to the things that they've done. But second response, even if these people come into power, there's massive backlash on these individuals. This is to say, if a murderer comes to power, people will get up and be angry about this, and that means that you're turning more people to be skeptical, which means there will be more eyes on parliament and more people looking at parliament. These are all exclusive benefits on public pressure and people and more eyes being on our side. You don't get that on their side of the house. So when it comes to this whole clash, because then on our side of the house, we give you concrete procedures that benefit people. We give you concrete ideas about why people don't play partisan politics anymore. We win this first clash.
Information.
But before more clash, yes, sir.
If a country is as hardline racist and vulnerable to populist manipulation as you claim, why is a sudden minority president likely to be met with blind acceptance as opposed to riots and anger?
Sir, because the policies actively benefit those people. This looks like, look, farmers saying that, look, okay, look, I'm at least getting those kinds of I'm actually getting my fertilizer and things like that. So I believe that there will be no actually because the policies that are actively benefiting them, because when they see those individuals actively in power, those kind of perceptions also change over time. This is, if you're a Tamil person behaving, actually giving the people what they wanted, you're actually going to change that perception over time. Second class is house there on who actually benefits, who actually betters politics. The only thing that I told you was this whole idea that look, there are political parties and therefore you need to benefit them. Their political parties, how they account. Two responses. Firstly, that when it comes to parties accountability, that doesn't essentially work. Because if you're popular, you're anyway going to be, you're not going to get the kind of you're not going to get that kind of party pressure that they actually talk to you about. Moreover than not, the parties are going to like go with these people, like the Republican Party with Donald Trump. This is to say that when Donald Trump uses rhetoric and even goes against what the Republican Party stands for, they rally behind it because the rhetoric he uses, right? But secondly, we tell you that on our side of the house, they actually break down that idea that you vote according to your party. This is to say that a person votes for the Republican Party just because his father, and that's just because his father, that's because that is family. Where wants to break up that norm and allow more diverse people and more diverse parties and more diverse ideas to come into parliament. Where they want to allow it to come into Senate. But thirdly, we tell you that when you break up this polarization, you essentially allow more people into this place, which means you have a marketplace of ideas and more minority representation and more of these people's issues coming into parliament. These are exclusive benefits that you get on side of proposition's world. You don't get this on their world because people don't get into power because you're still going to have people playing the same old dance with the same old tune and still playing partisan politics and not essentially care about anyone else, right? So if you weigh this whole clash up, on our side of the house, you get people, you break down the societal norm that you vote according just because your family voted for it. But secondly, you actually, when you break down the polarization, you get all the benefits of allowing more people diverse on our side of the house. On Royal College's terms, none of this happens because you still have people play according to that popularistic view we're so proud to propose.
I thank the speaker for his speech, and whenever the adjudication panel is ready, call upon the op whip to state their case.
Says that your family influences the party you vote for. Here you say that the economic policy you believe in or the kind of trends that you want are dictated by the way you want. What that then means is that you don't trust individuals at all. So your family is a...
Cool, maybe just make sure we stay muted until you're ready to actually start the speech.
Sorry about that.
No,
can I be heard?
We're ready. Yep, we're ready when you are.
Honorable adjudicator and members of the House, when side proposition comes up and says that people are influenced by their family when it comes to choosing party systems or whatever, we tell you by that same logic, people make policy decisions based on the economics of the country, based on how well you were born into that or how economically stable you are. So based on that same logic, the government should actually hand out people there who they should vote for, depending on the political, depending on the economical standard that they have, or and the family background that they have. So by that same logic, you would be forcing people to go out there and vote for whoever they want. And that is the exact same thing that we stand against. We gave you sufficient analysis in our first argument on why paternalization of the government is really, really bad and leads to apathy, not refuted at all. And we will show you the implications of that, and we urge you to side with side opposition. Now, I have two classes for the House today. The first one being on this whole thing about partisan politics, and the second one being on which side will actually give out better governance. Now, no, thank you. Now, they come up and tell us in the third speech about this whole issue on the polarization of that the party system brings about. We tell you that, okay, fine, you're just replacing the polarization of the party system with polarization of politics. We tell you that whole thing about trying to change politics as a whole, no thank you, will not be there on your side of the house, because either way, this partisan the bad partisan politics that you talk about still find a way to creep in. And we tell you that the party system to act as a mechanism of accountability to ensure that these people actually go out there and implement their policies. Otherwise, the parties will take action against these people. So we tell you that all in all, no, thank you. That all in all, it's that their whole issue on polarization is not a mutually exclusive problem, and so on and so on. And then further into this whole thing about this, because of getting rid of polarization, they come up and tell us that there's going to be a marketplace of ideas. Now, let me tell you, the fact of the matter is we prove to you in our second argument that apathy will, that apathy will happen due to these sort of things. The fact of the matter is people are fed up with the government force feeding them what they want to do. They're fed up with the government manipulating what they want to do. And we tell you that that is really harmful, and that leads to things like apathy. So when there's apathy, there's going to be a less marketplace of ideas, because the same people who would vote are the same people who vote in people of similar policies. So that itself, all the net benefits that they brought about do not stand at all. Now, secondly, they come up and tell us that, okay, fine, backlash is going to happen to vote people out the second time. First of all, you're not going to know whether this person is the same person who's going to ask for the second. You don't know if this person who asked for the second time is the same person who got into power earlier. You don't know that. It's a risk. And even if you want to vote this person out, then you will have to change your political ideologies. You'll have to change your political policies. And we tell you that that is no thank you. That is unfair and undemocratic, because you're telling a person how to vote. But secondly, even if that is true, it buys into our argument that delegitimizes the state, because that delegitimizes the government. Because we told you in our second argument on the trend of apathy that when a person comes into power and the person is not what everyone else expects, they go out there and they will say, oh, we didn't know what this system is about. We didn't want this person in. The government fed us lies. The government manipulated. Yeah, no, thank you. Because their system is made in such a way where it's so easy to lie about policy and to lie about certain things and get your way in. It doesn't matter that how good your policy is on paper if you cannot implement the policy in parliament. And we gave you sufficient and enough more analysis as to why that is so important, because and that fuels the whole the argument of backlash, buys into argument on delegitimize the government, because people will want to opt out of the system, and then the government loses whatever credibility that it has. So all in all, we take that point as a whole. Now they come up and tell us that okay, fine, no thank you. They come up and tell us that on our side, no thank you. They come up and tell us on racial biases or whatever. We asked you in the POI that that racial biases are important to a certain extent, because if the country is majority racist, which we don't really like countries being racist, but if there are racists, a minority coming into the position of president is not going to make a huge difference, because the fact of the matter is, no thank you, majority of people will lose support in that person, and it's really, really bad, which will lead to things like riots, which will lead to things like further motive against the government and anti-government sentiments, which actually delegitimize the government further and destroy this whole thing about democracy. Now moving on to my second clash on which side on this whole thing about partisan politics as a whole. Now, first of all, they come up and try and talk to us about this whole thing about populists coming into power. No, thank you. And they tell us that, okay, now fine, now populists, we asked them a POI on how populists would come into power using good policies or whatever. We tell you, and they came up and told us that it matters only on policy or whatever. We tell you then that the people vote out populists based on policy, and the reason that populists get voted in is because of rhetoric. Then we tell you that then populists wouldn't get into power in the first place, because no matter how good the policy of other people are, if people, no matter how good the policy of these populists are, it doesn't really matter. Now, moving on to another point that they come up and tell us is that there's going to be cheating on our side in terms of rhetoric or whatever. We tell you that, no, thank you. And they came up and gave us these arguments on how the good policies get crowded out and how it delegitimizes these people. And they gave us the examples of AOC or whatnot. And we tell you that first of all, that is not true. In status quo, you have opposition, and you have you have the opposition and people, and you have different types of media, a balanced media that show off both left and right views as well. And we tell you that even if that is not the case, no, thank you. Even if that is not the case, this the micromanaging aspects of politics or whatever can still go. They can still get pointed out. And the fact of the matter is, they don't prevent the people that they so-called don't want getting into power. They don't. The people they don't want getting into power are not prevented getting into power by their motion. They haven't shown us how exclusive that motion is to like get rid of all the people or the bad people that they talk about. The fact of the matter is, these populists or these really racist people or whatever still have the opportunity to get into power on that side. Whereas on our side, you lose the benefit of discourse and other people pointing out that these people have these certain flaws, that these people are racist, or that these people don't know how to implement their policy. And you lose out on that mutually exclusive benefit that is extremely harmful for everyone and the people in the country. Now, another important thing that they fail to rebut, and this is really crucial. The fact of the matter is, rhetoric is as important as good policy. The fact of the matter is, it's finding the perfect balance between the two. I don't see any parliamentarians getting into power just because they have good rhetoric. You have to have the good policy to back them up. And we tell you, because of these things, because we don't want women who have been abused sexually to vote for sexual offender, also, we urge you to side with side opposition. Thank you.
That concludes the first round of the debate. In the second round, which will be the replies, speeches will be 4 minutes long, with 1 tap at 3 minutes and 2 taps at 4 minutes, and the speaker will be drowned out after a 15-second grace period. Whenever the panel is ready, I call upon the opposition leader for the reply speech. Opposition leader.
Good to go, ready when you are.
At the end of this debate, I think I understand the issue with government. That is, their side is a marriage of this conception of superiority of themselves. That is a paternalistic view that they're able to decide what is good for people, even though the people might not necessarily want that themselves, coupled with this blind naivety that goes around saying that we can get rid and change the entire system, but they don't necessarily mechanize. Those two factors, panel, do 2 questions I'm going to answer. The first is whether character is a reasonable judge of policy. The second is as to the pragmatic implications in terms of general policy. The first question I'm going to answer is, can you judge a person's character by things? The first thing we told you that it's often a complex thing where it's a marriage between 2 factors, that is a person's policy and a person's rhetoric. Notice that this is significantly more sophisticated than their blanket statement that, oh look, rhetoric crowds everything out and rhetoric is simply unimportant. Let's change the entire system so rhetoric isn't a factor at all. Why is that harmful? The first is, in their world, you're unlikely to have things like debates. You're unlikely to it's being overly scrutinized. That means that it's harmful because you're not going to know how likely candidates are to deliver. But second, you lose out on the means of holding individuals accountable, because their only response to that is, look, you can get backlash to vote them out. Backlash how, panel? When you don't know who exactly you voted in. Backlash when you don't know who you're holding accountable. But also, if you've done a bad job during your tenure, the point is your policies are going to be approximate to what they were before you got in, which means you're going to either have to change your political leaning slightly to vote in a different candidate, or else does backlash mean you're going to like try to get the government of power through other means? If so, they then concede to our second argument. The third thing we told you is you're able to identify which policies people are likely to prioritize. So if you're talking about A or C, like the Green New Deal, for instance, you're able to know what policies a candidate prioritizes only in instances where you've seen them talk about policies. You know what they're passionate about. You know how they interact with people. But finally, and this is important, you understand how likely they are to get your interest through, how likely they are to support coalitions, how likely they are to make friends with other politicians and be able to like draft up minority coalitions and get your interest into the forefront. The only response to this is like this flippant argument we hear in third speech where they say, oh, but we're going to change the system. We're going to get this magical normative shift as to rhetoric being completely unimportant and only people who are like hardline policy. The point is, still you're going to get at least a proportion of people who are rhetorical, who are still going to control what happens in that instance. But second, notice that the fact that you have rhetoric allows things that are fringe and are good ideas to come into the mainstream. And since this came in Op 3, I'm assuming that since this came in like Prop 3, I'm assuming I can bring this matter forward, that AOC got into power and the Green New Deal shot to the forefront. The point is that rhetoric ensures that your interests can get heard. But finally, notice the most problematic implication of their case. The fact is they come to a decision that populists are bad. Because I don't think populists are as bad as they claim. Because if you look at the reason people like Trump, like Duda, like Bolsonaro get into power, there are often hardline disillusionment in terms of the people that relate like one particular policy. In terms of Trump, it's sending migrants out of your country. In terms of Narendra Modi, it's an India first narrative that supports the Hindus. The point is the majority of these can be written down in policy as well. So we don't think that's necessarily bad, but they don't solve populists getting out of power either. So what you ultimately trade off at the end of the day is the conception of democracy, that you as an individual loses out on the democratic legitimacy that you give the system by having a meaningful choice. That means simply in terms of principle, if they trade off democracy, they lose this debate. The second question is one on politics. And here the only argumentation we hear is minority individuals get into power and you get a diversified marketplace of ideas. The first thing we tell you is that when minorities get into power, the likely response is going to be one of anger and fear. Because if it's as racialized as they claim, why is the response not likely to be riots? I think that simply washes out because we don't understand where that's coming from. But the second and more problematic implication is you get mass apathy, where people are already disillusioned with the identity politics of the left. Hence, they turn to people like Trump, who now feel like the government is trying to force feed them what they should and have to believe in. It is these individuals that go out and they lose out on the marketplace of ideas. Less individuals holding politics in check, less individuals looking at who needs to be in power, less individuals dictating policy. For all these reasons, panel, opposition takes this debate.
I thank the speaker for his speech and now call upon the Prime Minister to state his case. The reply.
This debate revolved around the idea of which side protects the integrity of the electoral system. Both sides agreed on the importance of who you elect to lead, right? However, they failed to understand the importance of a policy being thought differently from the politician, right? Because that is what allows for democracy and that is what allows for better governance. So proud to propose. We think that OP lost this debate because they ignored our analysis on the influence of outside factors on a voter's mindset, right? Because things like race, things like gender, orientation, and most importantly, rhetoric are matter in status quo. And we told you the harms of this, right? Because one, it leads to misguided decisions, right? Essentially, people are essentially blinded by prejudice and they vote against you because of that, even if it harms your own. That is what happened with Obamacare. You think that inherently goes against everything that democracy stands for. But two, it makes people very susceptible to manipulation through rhetoric, right? Because that is one, principally unfair, and B, allows for dangerous ideas to spread in a society for votes, right? And that is what leads to things like minorities being harmed and blind allegiance to one person regardless of the policy. Their world is one where they essentially prioritize style over substance, assuming that allows transparency, something that we told you you do not see in status quo, something that was never responded to. Our side is one where you take away that prejudice in society and you set a precedent that these outside factors do not matter. That allows for more representation. That allows for the subversion of stereotypes, and that allows to change mindsets, something they did not respond. One main question that came up in this debate on who leads to a better society. All they've told you is that they support status quo. And because of that, in status quo, no one cares about policies and rhetoric is more beneficial. We think that the system in status quo led to people like Trump, Duterte, Bolsonaro, and Johnson, right? So we don't think it fundamentally works. But regardless, we gave you responses, right? We gave you three. Firstly, we told you that we make better policies as a whole, right? Because now that policies are all that matter, you create an incentive to have the most appealing policy to the majority. A policy that is purely based on factual analysis, as we told you in our model. That is what creates a more efficient ideas that most people will support. That is what curtails extremists from making false claims and forces them to be realistic and reasonable. That is what makes you fundamentally care about policies, because that's what people do in status quo, because of how effective policies are on their life. We gave you examples of things like women and abortions and farmers and subsidies. Second response was that we better politicians, right? Because now you had the people behind the groundbreaking ideas running for office, right? Now you have the most competent, such as the extremely educated, not burdened by these outside factors, and actually have a chance to implement their policies. Again, something not responded to. The impact of all this is a better government, a government of reasonable policies that headlined by reasonable people, people who don't rely on manipulation or mindset. And that's what creates unity, cohesion, and support for a government and fixes the problems in status quo. Lastly, we told you about the promotion of discourse, because you don't have organizations like Fox News criticizing politicians on outside factors. Instead, you have them debating that policy. That's what leads to people gaining more comprehensive knowledge of these policies. That's what leads to more informed, unbiased decisions. So we see that their best case is one where we disregard all our principles and all our harms in status quo. And we live in a world where rhetoric has these benefits, right? We still have better policies on our side of the house. We still make more reliable politicians, and we still have a government that upholds democracy. Our worst case scenario, where policies don't matter in status quo, we change the norm. We create a society where policies take precedent and make things better. That's what creates representation, changes mindsets, and helps the most vulnerable. We are the side that gets rid of the precedent where the worst types of people, the least deserving, are the ones in power. We are the side that protects the people. I've never been more proud to propose.
That concludes the finals, and I thank both sides for excellent debate. We'll now be moving all the adjudication panel to a breakout room. But just for clarification, to send in your ballots, only the chair judge has access to all 5 ballots. So the chair judge has to enter his or her ballot, his ballot, and enter the ballots and the scores for all the other judges and send it in together. I'll now allocate you all to breakout rooms. Thank you.